Dave walked into my office, which is kind of his office because we've shared an office for a long time. I don't know, about 2007, 2008. And he said, I figured out a way to do what Google's doing while protecting privacy and managing the data underneath. And I was like, what? And you got to keep the following in mind: is I've never gone wrong betting on an idea he's had. And I was like, okay, what's the idea? And he basically conceived of an inversion of the way data is collected. And instead of data sort of being sucked up into something like Google, at the time the idea was the data would stay on the device, and ads would come to the device and trade in the device. So the personal data would never leave the personal environment of the user. And of course, there's variations on that, which include having a sort of a virtual version of the device in a trusted third party, and then having things come to the trusted third party. But that was the beginning of Intertrust's walk into data rights management for cloud-based data. And we did a lot with advertising. We've now moved on into energy and automotive and other types of data in a more horizontal fashion. But this is really the systems approach. Let's take a platform view of how the leg bone is connected to the hip bone, make sure all the rights and interests are protected in the value chain, and then see where it goes. So with that introduction, Dave, I mean, we talk about like what brought you to this conclusion, but how do you see these secure systems coming about, not just within enterprises, but between enterprises? And I'd like you to go from there, leading off to how algorithms can play a role within these types of platforms.
Well, to follow along the story of the system we talked about in 2008, which is something that we called Personograph, which was a way in which all of the interactions that you might have, let's say, with your devices, the data gets collected into an environment that you can control. And one of the things that you can do is you have systems whereby you can sort of auction off things like advertisements and things of that sort to the highest bidder. And some people are going to be more interesting than others. They'll probably get more income from that kind of thing. The problem with all of that was that this was is what I like to call it, if I ruled the world kind of introduction of technology. The rest of the advertising world, the rest of the content world, et cetera, had to play in on this and to try to coordinate the content world and the advertising world and the technology world, especially from a little company. But even if it were Google who was trying to pull this off, it just would not have succeeded, because we have to find a way in which pretty much the entire ecosystem, as they say, would play by some sort of role like this. Now, the problem with just saying, let's take something like differential privacy, which is a way in which information about individuals can be protected when individuals are contribute to some really big database. Let's say like the U.S. Census. There are contexts in which that will work pretty well, and it looks like it might work fairly well with the census. This thing called differential privacy is a way of sort of trading off precision of information that you get back from queries for protection of individual rights. Apple is using that nowadays. The problem with it in a more general context is that the computing models are all changing. We don't know where to apply that particular concept anymore. And we don't know what the system is, in other words. Just to finish up on this idea, it used to be that when we went to search for something, we would type into a keyboard, and we would get a response back from an application called Google, or in the old days Alta Vista, or whatever it might be. You were interacting with an application. Nowadays, you're asking Alexa, you're asking Siri, or something like that. You're not typing through a keyboard. You're actually asking a service that's collecting all of this data. So the information is not really going, in fact, sometimes it'll be relayed to an application, but it's now going to the, what people are calling an operating system service. And people don't really understand the implications of that, and neither do we as computer scientists understand, well, how are we going to be able to really take care of protecting all of that information when some of it at some time is going to go to an application, and the other time it's Apple that's parsing out what, where that stuff goes. And regulators are going to have a tough time trying to figure out how to deal with that particular computing model. And that's just a computing model that arose, 3 or 4 years ago. So that's the tough thing, just defining what the system is that's relevant is probably going to be our biggest challenge to begin with. And then we can do what you say, just decide to use individual technologies as algorithms or look at it from a more global system point of view.
Would any of the other panelists like to jump in here?
Does it work now? Yeah, thanks. Yeah, so maybe I think this is a great introduction, and I would maybe even go one step back and try to understand really the trends that are leading actually to these changes in technology and difficulties actually for us to to ensure privacy. If I may ask a few questions, would that be okay to see actually how the so it's my yeah. So I guess you all would be saying that privacy is a human right and you would like that to be protected. Is there anyone not agreeing to that? Okay. And I could assume that you all have mobile phones, correct? Is there anyone without a mobile phone or a homemade mobile phone that are nowadays some companies offering? No? Okay. And who of you believes that actually you still have oversight on how your data is used, personal data collected in these phones? Is there anyone that would believe that he is in control? Okay. Is there anyone thinking that I'm suggesting that there is no privacy? No, okay. No, I'm not suggesting that. But I think what was just said, I think, and if you go one step back from that and see what are the trends, I mean, there is a strong AI and data science trend where actually a lot of information can be just used to identify people in a way that it was not possible before. We just had also in the keynote speech discussion about Talal and how can we actually identify certain information from some other information, and that's actually picking up very rapidly. And if you look, industry is picking up data science and AI, so that trend is progressing quite fast. On the other hand, we have trend related to privacy and creation of privacy technologies, all kind of multi-party computation, zero knowledge proofs, all kind of different things. But if I would look and if I would believe that actually this trend is not, the industry is not picking up so much these technologies, and the question is why? Are the business models problematic, or maybe we as people are problematic because we define how we live, we define our society, we define the companies, and we decide actually whether we will share this data on a mobile phone or not, whether we will just read consent form or not. So that's my thesis.
I just want to touch, I know I'm supposed to be moderating, but I'll just want to throw an opinion on top of what you just said, which is the closer you get to product and the closer you get to market, I think things have to be very efficient and very practical. And I think a lot of these newer technologies are, and I want to loop around and come back to this later and just throw this to Bob. I think a lot of the cooler stuffs when you start talking about differential privacy or homomorphic encryption or that kind of stuff that lures people in, and they basically are just, when it goes to the engineers look at this and say, I can't put it in my mouth, I can't chew it, I can't swallow it, get it out of here. And you end up with these systems that are either built with whatever is available that have cracks and holes in them that get exploited, or obviously the bigger platforms just sort of don't want any of this stuff to deploy based on sort of creating the sort of information, occlusion of information, so to speak, that allows them to stand behind a curtain and pick and choose who they want to trade with. So with that, maybe I'll throw this to Andrew and see if you have any comments on what's being discussed.
Well, yes, I have some comments which is a little bit of a tangent. So this discussion so far has been about platforms or about systems and rules for using them. So we're here talking about legitimate users, possibly kind of obscured ways, sneaky ways to abuse it and so on, but still we're talking about kind of generally speaking, officially known systems, things that people might be able to understand if they spend the time reading the terms of service or reading the user manuals or other kinds of things. Something to keep in mind, though, is that there's another form of privacy erosion going on, which you can try to limit, but you cannot really stop, namely illicit erosion of privacy. Cameras are shrinking. Okay, I mean, we have these instances, I think that South Korea passed some laws. I think the UK is about to pass some laws against upskirting, people placing cameras on the floors of restrooms and so on, taking pictures. Well, yes, you can, I think it's appropriate to pass such laws and you have to do it, but you will never be able to stop it because the technology is improving and you're not going to be able to stop it. So basically, we're reaching a stage where you'll need to, no matter what laws regulations you pass, you have to be prepared for just about anything you say or do to be visible to the public, some people. Furthermore, with the developments of deep fake technology, what it means is that just about anything might be visible. Things you have done as well as things you have not done or you may not even have thought of doing might be on the internet. So this will be a very new kind of environment. And we have to face it. And to some extent, this spread of some of these technologies like deep fakes, I think might help overcome some of these very, very negative effects of technology. Namely, it will be able to enable people to come up with plausible deniability. Okay, so yes, you show a picture of me giving a Nazi salute and so on. I say, no, I was there with Star of David in my hand or the Muslim crescent or something like that and so on. And any of those are equally plausible. Now, of course, if you bring in top experts who can examine, the files and look for timestamps and see for signs of manipulation, maybe you can then come closer to the truth of where the video comes from or who has altered it, but becomes harder and harder, and given the general growth in value of information, in most cases that will not be done. And so you will be able to, again, live in a world of relatively high information opacity, even though in principle, even some of your most intimate moments might be captured on camera and be out there in the cloud someplace.
Any questions? Are there any comments in the room at this point? I'd like to keep this as interactive. So your hand went up first, and then Ron.
Don't you think that this invasion of privacy is also linked a lot to society as a service that we live in? We don't buy a product anymore, we buy a service. And if you buy a service, you use it and you leave your footprints to use it instead of just buying something and running with it.
Yeah, clearly that's what's happening. That's what I'm saying is that even as you interact with computers, you're really interacting with services nowadays. And what I think we're going to need to do to deal with the new threats, the new technologies, and all of these things, you have to find a sort of a unifying concept of what does it mean to be able to control your data and to be able to grant somebody else in context the right to use it through a service interface or through an API or whatever it might be. And we have to have sort of principles that are easy for anybody to interpret in the different kinds of service contexts. And that's going to be difficult to do, but I don't see any other, when I say principles, I think there are going to be principles that will have to be encoded in statute. And in fact, any kind of protection technology, you need three things. You need the statute that says you have a right to protect this, and you need law enforcement, and then you have to have ways technology. So you have those three things, and they have to be defined in a somewhat more general context to be able to deal with all of the new situations. Well, we're just at the beginning of having some sort of statutory descriptions of what's reasonably allowable and what isn't. It's incredibly crude. In fact, I think it's the GDPR stuff, for example, is pretty ineffective. The stuff that we see all the time right now about the cookie stuff that's frustrating the hell out of people, that's nothing compared to the threats of cookies to the trackers that are in the JavaScript that's on all of this stuff. Where you find out that, or most people don't even understand, that when you're interacting with a web page, possibly a dozen people or a dozen entities are actually looking at exactly everything you're doing with that web page. And that's much more insidious, yet we don't hear anything about, how that's going to be practically controlled. But we could probably come up with principles that would ban it.
I mean, I think just from a technical point of view, obviously I agree with everything Dave said. The inversion of people going to services, and rather than having, sort of that paradigm, the paradigm where a person is a service and then services come to you is the right start, because that starts to invert the information flow in some way or another. And of course you add rights management to the whole thing, and all of a sudden you start to gate stuff. One thing I was surprised no one commented on in my talk this morning was theoretically, all of this is great, but if I were on the other side of this, I would argue that the amount of complexity that we're advocating that's now placed on the user and the user interface is so phenomenal that people just won't use it. But there's a lot of ways, whether it's AI or better UX design, to bring a level of sanity back to the equation that places things more in the user's hand, at least when they want to use it. But right now, a priori, you're basically screwed when you turn on a web browser.
Absolutely, and it facilitates the creation of kind of islands living in their own alternate reality, absolutely. But what that means is that we'll need to develop kind of new forms of trust, which again may be similar to the way that society kind of operated hundreds of thousands years ago in more primitive form. There are certain people you kind of trust and you take their word for, vouchsafe for them. Don't believe anything online unless you have some confirmation that it's trustworthy or so.
Well, I played around with an idea a few years ago. It's like sort of defining sort of the complexity of societal interactions as the concept of a social radius, where, sort of as we progressed through the Industrial Revolution and the population started to grow, the complexity of communicating with the other 2 billion people or 3 billion people on the planet became such that we all got isolated into these very compartmentalized structures, and then we delegated a lot of the complexity management to institutions like telcos and power companies and governments. What the internet's done and what social networks have done have actually sort of just pretty much cut with a knife across all of those institutions that we had created to help us manage the complexity of living in a world of billions of people. And what you just said reminded me of that. We effectively have a much smaller communication radius between any two individuals across the planet today than we've had since we were a few thousand cave people, talking about who's got the coolest flint. And that, I think, is creating a lot of problems for governments that were set up during periods where, people put eagles on the ceiling and had nations, right? I mean, it's a very Napoleonic concept, and that was just a complexity management mechanism.
If I can just interrupt to that point, that's one instance where privacy is maybe not a good thing, because one of the problems with the internet is anonymity, people feel allowed to just be their worst possible selves, and interaction has degenerated terrifically. So there are places where maybe you want less privacy, maybe you want to require identification of people. So
Well, it's a self-regulating system, right? So you're effectively, if you think of it's not binary, it's not just privacy or no privacy, but you have this knob you can turn, and it's sort of in multiple dimensions. What will happen is people won't trade information and services back to you unless you converge to an equilibrium between the two parties that, you know, sort of have an expectation of how the information will be handled. At the end of the day, human beings just conduct arbitrage on everything, and we have the ability, by divulging or not divulging information about our behavior, to shape the probability distribution that drives the arbitrage. So I don't see privacy or no privacy. I don't see it as a binary issue. I see it as a highly variant contextual issue. The question is, how do you capture that in the context of a computing system?
I think there's one other problem, which is, you know, how people value, let's say, privacy versus other things that are, let's say, engagement, being able to actually, in fact, engagement is the thing that that we know that Facebook measures and encourages. That's at a higher value than people's privacy or even real knowledge about what's true. So that's one of the problems is that we don't have a common set of values that for which we can set statutes. That's what the argument now is between the two Zuckerbergs there.
I think it's less about who has the information, but about what they do with it. If you want to put regulations into place, you need to put them into place concerning the consequences. What can you do with this information? What is allowed and what is not allowed?
So yes, so people have been talking about the concept of information fiduciaries. For example, also privacy in context and other kinds of things which relate to it. Absolutely, I don't think technology can help, can create certain tools which will help constrain flow of information, especially monitor flow of information. But then I think you'll need to watch what's done with that information, how it's exploited, and to what extent is it for the benefit of the of the individual or so.
So we have Yeah, I mean, I think it's a lot more. I agree with you in general that we need to regulate the behavior of the platforms in some way or another, which, you know, once upon a time, Microsoft was more evil than the Roman Empire, and now they're your friendly local biggest company in the world. But the problem of expecting the country where a certain social network is based just to do the right thing, is the definition of the right thing, is pretty complicated. And Zuckerberg brought this up, I think last week or the week before. He was testifying in the House of Representatives, and he whipped out the Chinese boogeyman, and he was like, well, Facebook, oh, we're nothing. I mean, look at WeChat, oh, it's like Tencent, they're huge. You don't want those Chinese people messing with us. And it's like, we do it the American way, and we don't want it done the Chinese way. And, it's a completely self-serving argument. And what's to say that one way is better than the other? The reason I say it's extra complicated is we are entering this era, sort of this transnational era, where we're moving to a least common denominator across society. I mean, you see the Arab Spring, you see what's happening in Hong Kong, you see what's happening across the world. The societal mechanisms and the government mechanisms that existed to sort of go back and forth between a government and its people are breaking down, because people now have tools that are made somewhere else that allow them to be highly, highly interactive, that are very difficult to control. So I'm not sure that some deus ex machina will descend from some regulatory body and somehow wave a wand and make these problems go away. I think we'll meet in the middle somewhere. There'll be some amount of regulation, some amount of technology, and it's going to push-pull. And it's my slide about technology got us into this mess. Technology will get us out of it. It's true, but then at the end of the day, there's going to be a lot of social disruption on the street. We'll go to Noah's question in a second, but the guy at the Wall Street Journal in San Francisco is a good friend of mine who covers Apple and some of these companies. When he first moved to the Valley, we were having a cup of coffee, and I said, what was your last beat? And he goes, oh, I covered the tobacco industry. I'm like, you're well prepared.
Can I get Google and I pay for it, and then nobody knows what I'm asking about? Now, how much Google would charge me living in Switzerland compared to a man in Thailand? How do you distinguish, between them if we go that way? So I'm asking too many hypothetical questions. In diplomacy, you're not supposed to do that. Thank you.
Well, it's very hard to say what it is that Google thinks, because Google is a very big organization. So, of course, you talk to the techies, like some of our friends and so on, they have a particular view, and they very often don't really think about the global issues. Then you look at the people in the business side, they are very often, again, compartmentalized. They are trying to maximize their revenues or minimize costs or other kinds of things. And then you probably have not such a large number of people thinking about a strategy. And it will be very interesting to hear what they say, but I don't think they'll tell you, at least they will not tell you honestly what they think. But yes, it's a very good question. You could have a paid service, but remember there is always incentive for, even if you were paying Google to provide you a service, there would still be an incentive for them to use the information in other ways. We have seen it in a variety of other contexts where companies violate their terms of service in order to exploit what they learn in that case. But that's one way to go, of course.
Just a general comment. Google is much more discreet and much quieter about their opinions about the stuff than Facebook. And Facebook, Zuckerberg has a very strong political agenda here. He's a zealot in terms of what he believes should be the way people share information. And that's marked him from the beginning, from the days he wrote the original social network at school. You pay for Netflix, and you get ad-free technical. And Netflix is a voracious data user. They generally don't trade the data, but they do in some cases, but they're not as bad as Facebook. The price is $9.99 for the subscription of Netflix. They've decided to arbitrage that amount of money against the probability distribution of how you watch movies. There are models like that in these data-driven companies, but you're paying for it with your information. A better place to start would be to really just educate people on the price. How badly, another way of asking the question is, how badly am I getting screwed? Who's making out better in that transaction? And I don't think you have to go far to figure that one out. But I'm not sure we're going to paid services. I think it's more that people will be more educated about what they can do, and they can target that information in more fine-grained ways. Dave's been working on architectures for trusted fiduciaries and sort of rights managed data platforms for over a decade now. We don't have the time to get into it here, but there are ways to structure these things so you can have privacy preserving platforms that still provide you with that type of convenience and still allow people to monetize the data without moving the data around the way they do right now. And go back to the slide of the environmental, the thing just dumping raw sewage. That's what you've got right now. And the point of that slide was really about how it is possible to go to the bathroom and have it end up in a place that doesn't kill every fish in the lake, and still, be able to enjoy both aspects of having good sewage in a nice lake. There are ways of architecting these things properly. I want to kind of go back to sort of some more technical issues. If we've and we can always come back to the society and technology theme later, but I want to ask, Bob has sort of been living in the world of sort of algorithms and theory of computer science for a long time. A couple of years ago, we got an email from this, I think it was like 16 or 17-year-old kid who had just walked out of the University of Pennsylvania to start a differential privacy company. And we thought it was a joke. And so we went over to his office, and lo and behold, it wasn't a joke. He was this child prodigy. He started a company, he's gotten it funded. Facebook uses his technology today. general question about the state of the art, not just with differential privacy, but the sort of basket of algorithms that are out there that include zero-knowledge systems, that include homomorphic encryption. These anonymizing technologies that are mostly based on mathematics and computer science. Where are we on the spectrum of I can go to Walmart and buy a differential privacy algorithm and plug it into my system, or come back in 10 years when all the math has been worked out? And will the math ever work out?
Well, my point of view on these things is there's a lot of cool technology out there. Some of it's useful, but people fall in love with the technology. If you have a hammer, you want to find a nail that you can hit it with. For example, blockchain. Everybody is trying to figure out where this can be used, but things are kind of backward. You got to identify what the problem is first. What is the problem you want to solve? And then what is the right technology to apply to it? Another example that is amazing to me is cryptocurrencies. This is the first version of blockchain, shall we say. Now Facebook wants to do a cryptocurrency. Is this really a solution to a societal problem, or is it something else? So we have to be very careful with these technologies. We have to figure out what the problem is and then find the technology that's going to work to help us solve it. And I think differential privacy, it's kind of the only game in town if you want to protect. So what does differential privacy do for you? If you have a database and you want to ask questions of the database, you can, through careful asking of questions, extract information about individuals, even though the questions aren't phrased that way. So the idea of differential privacy is you fuzz the data in such a way that you have some probabilistic guarantees that whether an individual is in the database or outside the database, you can't tell the difference in the answers. So you get some kind of technical guarantee that you're protected because you can't tell whether you're in there or not based upon the answers that come out. But these systems inevitably leak information over time because there's a so-called privacy budget. Eventually, you can discover everything by asking enough questions. So it's new and it's novel and people are trying to use it, but I think we don't entirely understand the consequences. And I think the real issues are in the systems domain. I mean, how do people really get around? People steal stuff, right? They find ways around all these technical barriers. So we really need to be very careful about designing the right systems. And the algorithms are good tools, but they're only tools, and we have to understand the whole context of the system. I mean, security is a funny business because the attacker has many places to attack, and you have to protect every single one of them. And the game is a lot easier for the attacker than for the defender.
Yeah, I'll follow along a little bit on that. I think the differential privacy applications are out there now, and it is showing that if you use the word tool, people are just learning how to use that tool. One of the more famous applications of differential privacy is in the way that Apple is using it to when it collects data as you interact with Siri and other operating system services. Huge amounts of data is collected. They're using differential privacy to allow some analysis of that data, aggregate analysis of that data. And as Bob mentioned, there's a so-called privacy budget. And the interesting thing is that they found out through the application that they need to of this privacy technology that they run out of the budget more quickly than they thought. So in their application, they just reset it. and they were kind of criticized for that, but yeah, well, sure, but I mean, at least they were trying. I mean, my point of view is that this is a new technology. Unless somebody starts using it in the real world, we'll always be debating whether or not it's going to be working. And I'm sort of looking forward to it being used in the census. They did some experiments in 2018 in data collection. It looked like it will work for that particular purpose. It is going to be applied for the 2020 census. And I think it's an important, the problems they're trying to solve there is pretty important. We're starting to ask much more politically volatile questions in the census, as many of you know who have been following American politics. And a lot of information that is going to be revealed or could be revealed from analysis of the census data that is actually published, unless somebody does something about that information leakage that Bob was talking about. Depend on what the, it just, in the physical world, you know, if somebody violates the law, they pay a penalty. Sometimes they go to prison. We haven't seen that happen, you know, in this kind of context, but it may be that the only way of ensuring that that doesn't happen as often as it probably is going to is by saying, look, this is something we value, and people pull that kind of stuff off, they go to prison. We haven't made that decision yet.
But I also think people are going to hide behind a lot of definitions about what they said they were doing and what they weren't doing and so on and so forth. The other problem is there's a bunch of companies out there that sell privacy-preserving technology. You slap it on the front end of whatever you're doing. Life is good. Let's say that worked in all its glory and it was perfect. All of a sudden, you're locked into talking to the world through a proprietary platform that, you know, is sort of, it's like encrypting all your data with somebody's like proprietary cipher, and they drop dead or they go out of business and you're locked out of your own information. That's another one. It's a fairly boring aspect to be careful what you buy into. We're very much at the beginning of all this stuff. But I mean, what I heard from Bob and Dave, and they were talking about it, it's funny, this systems guy was defending the algorithms guy was defending the system, but it's really a combination of the two. I mean, I think you need data architectures and system architectures that allow not just one institution, but multiple institutions to organize their data in a way that it's very hard for a malicious actor to access the data. But very importantly, we need mechanisms for interoperability to get around this problem of, oh, my privacy provider or my encryption provider just fell over and died. You also have, in any value chain, even when you have people who are partnering in a value chain, you have constructive tension. You know, so you have, you know, the doctor, the insurance company, the healthcare organization, they're supposed to cooperate to increase the value of the market, but at the same time, each one of them is trying to screw the other guy. So you have these weird sort of checks and balances that sort of emerge in the context of the way the market self-organizes. That has to be reflected in technology as well. So you need checks and balances, you need trusted third parties, you need auditors, you need that kind of infrastructure. And that's what the eventual secure system is going to be. And I don't think it's, I hope at least it's not, somebody like Microsoft comes off the mountain holding up MS-DOS and says, this is the way it's going to be, folks. Because we all saw how long it took for us to get out of that mess from a usability point of view. Another layer of this is going to be standardization. You can't rely on any one entity, one country, one company to really provide an effective holistic solution, right? So multiple actors have to get together and agree at least on the way to interface these technologies. And of course, there's a lot of security involved. So you need interoperability and standardization around secure formats. And then finally, you need legislation that not only deals with what happens when things go wrong, but how do we make sure things go right so things don't go wrong in the first place? And ultimately, social contract, because everybody wants their MTV. I mean, if you were elected king of the world and the first thing you said was, I care about the privacy of the children, I'm gonna take your Facebook away, you'd be out at the guillotine outside, you know, the next morning. I mean, people like their dopamine hits, right? So it's a complicated problem. I think we're really at the beginning of it. So speaking of dopamine, I mean, Milan lives in the world of, you know, Philips Research still is one of the great research institutions in the world, but Philips, of course, is pretty much the top healthcare technology provider in the world right now. You guys are living at the interface of, you know, healthcare providers and hospitals asking you for internet-connected devices and internet-connected equipment. Of course, these things are now beginning to spew. Forget about, like, you know, what movie I liked and where I had dinner last night. You're talking about somebody's MRI or somebody's mammogram like floating around the internet. What are you guys seeing? I mean, where are you going for solutions, or are you hoping that somebody else takes care of the problem?
Actually, maybe it's a good good moment to acknowledge Intertrust for being very early in this concept of sending algorithms to data. And I remember, like we were discussing this maybe 10 years ago, or even earlier than that. So, and recently I was talking with policymakers on healthcare with European Commission, and they said, "Oh, we learned about the concept of visiting data, and that's a great concept." So cool. So I think, as you just said, I think there are many challenges. You mentioned standardization, interoperability. You mentioned also regulation. All these need to be in place actually to allow these type of things. Nowadays, what we are doing, we are implementing this concept with a few in a B2B setting, with a few hospitals and insurance companies, and then it's easier. But if you really would like to have people donating their data, like they are able to donate their organs, then you need to provide them to scale up this, and we are not there. But we hope actually to collectively actually do open innovation and collectively get there.
What's the hottest research project that Philips research right now in this area?
We do secure multi-party computation, for example. We do showing in practice how actually this concept can work when you do federated learning with different institutions.
Cool. Any questions? I think my timer went off. I think we hit the end, but take your time, because no one's telling us to stop talking. So as long as you guys are enjoying it.
Are we fighting a war that we finally cannot win if we cannot find a good definition for privacy? So how can we solve the problem? How can we find an algorithm if there are contradicting definitions of what privacy is? So how can we find a good solution for that?
Well, I guess, I mean, there was a lot of really good talks this morning around the theme that we've got to define the problem, and it's a difficult problem to define. But I think that the operational definition, if you will, of privacy ultimately, looking at the motivation that at least I got out of Andrew's talk is, as well as Lizzie's, is that it's the ability to control your ability to control the information about you and the context in which it may be used, who and in what kind of context. And that's very different than what people's normal instincts about privacy are. But that's fine. We just to say that's what it is, okay? And that's what the regulators and the legislators ought to be focusing on. So I think we can define it. Now, I haven't heard, I've talked about this for, about 10 years. I haven't heard anybody say that that's not a good definition. I think it's not the only definition, but that's a pretty good one to focus on. And if we can lick that one, then I think we'll be okay.
No, there isn't, but I mean, there's context. I mean, this has been one of the themes all morning. This context is very important, but one of the nice things about computers is you can program them. So it's a space-varying, time-varying problem, but it's programmable. That's why in my talk, and that's why I frame it to myself as a rights management problem. And digital rights management is about being able to encode and vary rights contextually in a secure processing environment. So I think the point you're trying to make is this is a fabulously complicated problem. Because the whole world is interconnected, it pulls in all sorts of societal and cultural issues as well as technical issues. But by no means I don't want to speak for the panel, but I mean, I believe personally that there are many solutions to the problem. And I don't think one company is going to come out and solve them. I think it's going to be a self-organizing system with a lot of people inventing stuff, writing code. A lot of people will fail. A lot of people will succeed, and eventually we'll be happier.